Hey everyone, it's Jesslyn here, and I'm going to begin my presentation on the transformational and transactional leadership paradigm. The goals of this presentation are to first define what exactly the terms transformational and transactional leadership mean, and the behaviors associated with each. Then I'll go into some published literature where transformational leadership behaviors have shown positive effects in several types of contexts, namely healthcare, the military, and sport. Next, I'll explain how these leadership approaches can actually act as complementary constructs, known as the augmentation hypothesis. Then, I'll provide some real-life examples of people, such as the NBA coach Greg Popovich and former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, whom I think portray these styles of leadership in hopes of furthering your understanding of these concepts. And lastly, I'll provide a take-home message from this session. All right, so here we go. Now, back in 1978, a very distinguished leadership scholar by the name of James McGregor Burns introduced two types of leadership styles, transformational and transactional. Let's talk about transformational first. This style of leadership he described as a process where leaders and their followers help each other to advance to a higher level of morale and motivation. This leader stimulates and inspires their followers to achieve extraordinary outcomes by elevating the interests of his or her subordinates, generating acceptance of the vision and mission of the group, and encourages employees to look beyond their own self-interest for the betterment of the group. Transactional leaders, on the other hand, make contact with others for purposes of exchanging valued outcomes. This approach does not encourage shifts in beliefs, needs, or values of followers, but instead works through creating clear structures whereby it is understood what is required of the followers and the reward that they get from following orders. With these two leaderships in mind, another leadership expert by the name of Bernard Bass later had an idea to expand on Burns's original terms to explain the psychological mechanisms that underlie transformational and transactional leadership. Beginning with transformational, the first component is idealized influence, or charisma, as some researchers call it. This refers to the extent to which a leader models behaviors or values and place followers' needs above their own. The leader provides vision and a sense of mission for the group. Inspirational motivation pertains to the way the leader communicates expectations and provides meaning in shared goals in order to foster work ethic and teamwork. Intellectual stimulation is the extent to which the leader encourages creativity, innovation, and problem solving amongst individuals. Lastly, individualized consideration is the way in which the leader views each individual's needs and gives personal attention. Followers are treated differently according to their own abilities. The four components of transactional style begin with contingent reward, where leaders consult with followers regarding contracts indicating what is to be done in exchange for implicit or explicit rewards. Active management by exception is when they monitor followers' performance and actively search for individuals' mistakes. Engaging in passive management by exception means leaders wait for mistakes to be brought to their attention before intervening with criticism and then taking the necessary corrective action. Lastly, laissez-faire is simply the absence of leadership, where the leader avoids making decisions or taking responsibility at all. Now, as I said before, transformational leadership has received much empirical attention by highlighting performance benefits for followers experiencing this type of leadership across a variety of settings, including healthcare, business, the military, education, and sports. In this presentation, I will give examples in healthcare, the military, and sports specifically, showing that transformational leadership is most certainly not limited to any one type of setting, age group, gender, or role. Some researchers claim that the former autocratic leadership in nursing practices has been successfully challenged by the advantages of transformational leadership. In fact, training and educating healthcare managers in transformational leadership approaches can be an effective method for creating a positive workplace environment, as claimed by some studies. Now, according to the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, our country has had its struggles with nursing shortages and high turnover rate among staff nurses over the past years. Researchers McDaniel and Wolf investigated leadership characteristics of nurse administrators and their effect on nurse retention and job satisfaction among 77 staff nurses in Pennsylvania. What they found was that when staff nurses were provided with transformational leadership behaviors, such as their leaders supporting and sharing a vision of nursing, encouraging the nursing staff in their work and in the accomplishment of their nursing goals, and thirdly, getting followers to try out new behavior and seek new solutions to develop and improve in their respective positions. These types of behaviors led to an increase in employee satisfaction and a low staff turnover of 10% in this setting. Switching over to a military setting, DeVere et al. Investigated the impact of transformational leadership, enhanced by training, on follower development and performance using 3 military positions: military leaders, like generals, their direct followers, such as colonels, and their indirect followers, first lieutenants, for example. After training one group of leaders in transformational approaches to leadership, which focused on concepts of relationships, behaviors, motivation, morality, empowerment, and many other behaviors that are considered contrasts to transactional leadership, researchers discovered that there was an increase in direct follower development. They displayed increased scores of extra effort, collectivism, professionalism, moral values, and engagement. Furthermore, there was an increase in indirect follower performance as well, scoring higher on physical fitness testing, written and practical tests, obstacle course testing, and marksmanship. Finally, the third context we'll look at is a sports setting. In this study, Charbonneau et al. Developed and tested a model in which transformational leadership affects sport performance indirectly through the mediating effects of intrinsic motivation. The way they did this was by gathering data from male and female university athletes from a variety of sports, 168 participants to be exact, regarding their perception of their coach's transformational leadership and their own intrinsic motivation. This was done around the midpoint of their seasons for their respective sports. Then, at the end of the season, their coaches provided performance data on each of their athletes. What these researchers found is shown in this proposed structural model here that Charbonneau et al. Designed. They claim that performance was predicted by athletes' intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation was predicted by the coach's transformational leadership. Therefore, there is a strong support for intrinsic motivation, a major behavioral component of transformational leadership, as a mediator between the relationship of transformational leadership and athletic performance. Now, while there is a large amount of research highlighting the benefits of transformational leadership, let's not forget about the transactional style. Burns originally theorized that transformational and transactional leadership were mutually exclusive styles. Bass, on the other hand, thought otherwise. Bass viewed the transformational-transactional leadership paradigm as being comprised of complementary rather than polar constructs. Although conceptually exclusive, he said a behavior such as contingent reward, like praise or recognition, and a behavior such as charisma, both may be displayed by the same individual leader and lead to achievement of desired goals and objectives. In this way, employee roles and responsibilities are clarified, and follower self-interests are dealt with by the leader who uses contingent reward behavior. Yet, heightened leadership effectiveness will be associated with the charismatic leader, one in whom the followers have faith and emotional attachment, and with whom they can identify. Therefore, a manager, coach, teacher, or other leadership role type may display both transactional and transformational behaviors and be effective toward their subordinates. In this way, transformational leadership augments transactional supervision to achieve higher levels of follower performance, known as the augmentation hypothesis. Several studies have indeed shown that contingent reward and charismatic behaviors significantly related to multiple measures of leadership effectiveness amongst different populations, such as the United States Navy officers and martial arts athletes. So now, I'd like to give you some examples of transformational leaders and transactional leaders in the world, past and present. Let's start with transformational leaders. I could think of a few, such as Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Walt Disney, Greg Popovich, and Pat Summitt. I'm going to pick Greg Popovich and go into a little more detail about him. Popovich has been the head coach of the San Antonio Spurs NBA team since 1996, turning a mediocre team that not many people talked about into a powerhouse team that exemplifies textbook basketball. Popovich implements some very key pieces of transformational leadership within his coaching philosophy. Coach Popovich works at building a meaningful coach-athlete relationship with each of his players. He insists that coaches want their players to realize that you care about them and are interested in one another. In that regard, your players start to feel a responsibility towards each other, and they want to compete and succeed for one another. Both Popovich and his athletes have developed respectful relationships. They care and trust each other by involving one another in their lives in more aspects other than just putting a ball through a hoop. On another level, Popovich has built his reputation as an organization known for its high character. In fact, he's been able to maintain all-star caliber players such as Tim Duncan and Tony Parker for at times below market value for many years through this program that's grounded in moral foundations. And now if that's not enough proof of success from Coach Popovich, I'll also just mention that he's been Coach of the Year 3 times, won 5 NBA championships, and has never had a season below 500 since 1997, making him the 7th winningest coach in NBA history. Next, let's think of a few transactional leaders in the world, which can sometimes be a bit more difficult to name. I have here Margaret Thatcher, politicians Dwight Eisenhower and Joseph McCarthy, former Hewlett-Packard CEO Carly Fiorina, and Bill Belichick, who I'm sure some of you Patriot fans are already arguing with me about from behind your computer screens, but we can debate about that another time. So let's talk about Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1979 to 1990, in many ways exhibited a transactional style of leadership. She was well known for approaching followers with an eye towards exchanging, forming relationships with political members based on attempts to achieve executive objectives or titles that other members didn't always necessarily agree with. She was described as a ruthless leader and caused followers to feel intimidated and fearful due to her behaviors. She had power and authority over those beneath her, and she was often described as pragmatic, intimidating, and dominant. When cabinet members weren't in line with her own economic thinking, she had a history of dismissing those who questioned her. Now, I want to be clear in that this is not to say that Thatcher wasn't successful. Indeed, she was the first female Prime Minister of the UK and helped end the Cold War, to say the least. But while she was successful in achieving many of the objectives that she herself had set out to complete, it was not necessarily satisfying to everyone involved, and she is just one example of the inequalities that can affect an exclusively transactional style of leadership. Now, while much of the research is in positive regards to transformational leadership, I don't want us to forget what I said earlier when talking about the augmentation hypothesis and the transformational-transactional leadership paradigm as being comprised of complementary rather than polar constructs. We've all experienced a variety of coaches, teachers, and bosses who lead in many different ways that we may have agreed with or not agreed with. But when I think about great leaders I've had in my life, I realize these leaders exemplified the entirety of what a transformational leader is. Idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration, but also leaning on certain aspects of transactional leadership at different times of the year or season, depending on the circumstance or person they were leading. Whatever context we are looking at, from the sports field to the classroom to the workplace, I think beginning from a solid foundation of transformational behaviors is a great place to start. But as literature shows, transactional tendencies might need to be called upon at particular times. Play around with these behaviors in your own coaching or leadership setting and find out what works for you. Well, that's the end of my presentation. I hope you now have a better understanding about the transformational-transactional leadership paradigm and that it helps you construct an image of the type of leader you wish to be. Thanks for listening.